The audience never saw it, not when the camera panned across a ballroom catching a regal profile, not when the matinee idol swept a leading lady into his arms, not when the horror villain lunged from the shadows with monstrous fury, because it wasn't meant to be seen. In the golden age of Hollywood, the studio lights cast a glow so blinding it could bury truth beneath layers of powder, prosthetics, and polished myth. Moviegoers saw gods and goddesses, flawless and eternal. What they never saw, what they were never allowed to imagine, were the bodies behind the illusion. Bodies twisted by disease, faces reshaped by genetic disorders, limbs weakened by pain, bones cracked beneath silk suits, voices trembling behind dialogue dubbed in post. For decades, Hollywood wasn't just selling dreams, it was erasing anything that didn't fit inside them. And yet, some stars slipped through. Some were too brilliant to ignore, their talent undeniable, even if their bodies betrayed the myth. Others were used, fetishized for their difference, then discarded. But all of them lived double lives, one for the screen, one for the mirror. This is their story, the strange physical deformities and hidden disabilities that Hollywood tried to keep under wraps. A world of whispered diagnoses, makeup wizardry, camera tricks, and brutal silences, where a smile on screen masked a wince off it, where a limp became a legend, or a liability. These were not broken people. They were whole beings fighting to be seen, exactly as they were. And now, finally, we will see them. Chapter 1. The Hidden Deformities of Horror Icons. It's a strange irony. In the very genre built on grotesquerie and fear, some of Hollywood's most unsettling performances came not from masks or makeup, but from reality itself. No one embodied this contradiction more than Rondo Hatton. Born in 1894 in Hagerstown, Maryland, Rondo Hatton started life as a classically handsome man. Tall, athletic, with the symmetrical jawline of a future leading man, he was voted the handsomest boy in his high school class. But by the time he reached adulthood, something had begun to change. His hands grew thick and gnarled. His forehead expanded. His facial bones warped outward. A mysterious transformation was underway. The cause was acromegaly, a rare disorder where the pituitary gland secretes excess growth hormone, leading to the enlargement of bones and tissues, especially in the face, hands, and feet. There was no cure, and the effects were irreversible. But in the world of 1930s Hollywood, truth was far too inconvenient. When Rondo found his way into the film industry, studios concocted a more palatable explanation. His disfigurement, they claimed, was the result of exposure to German mustard gas during World War I. It was a lie, one repeated so often in press kits and interviews that even today it still shows up in obituaries and fan pages. The reality: Rondo never saw combat. His deformities weren't wounds of war. They were the slow, painful sculpting of his own biology. Hollywood didn't mind exploiting his look, as long as they could control the story. Universal Pictures, the studio behind legends like Dracula and Frankenstein, saw a new kind of monster in Rondo. He played the Creeper in multiple horror films. His real face marketed as a natural monster, no makeup required. His roles were silent, menacing, animalistic, often without a single line of dialogue. He was terrifying because he was real. But Rondo wasn't a monster. Off-screen, he was soft-spoken and gentlemanly. A former journalist who never intended to become an actor, he was deeply aware of how he was seen, and how little say he had in that perception. As his condition progressed, even simple tasks became difficult. Breathing, walking, standing for long takes, each required growing effort. Yet he pushed on, playing roles that capitalized on his difference because the camera had finally given him a purpose, even as it stripped him of his humanity. Rondo Hatton died in 1946 at the age of 51, likely from complications related to acromegaly, specifically heart failure brought on by the strain his body endured. Hollywood remembered him as the Creeper, but in truth, he was the one who had been chased by a disease, by exploitation, and by a fame that saw only what was on the surface. And he wasn't alone. Just over a decade earlier, In 1932, Todd Browning's infamous film Freaks stunned audiences and horrified censors. Banned for decades, the film featured real-life sideshow performers, including one who remains both an enigma and a symbol, Schlitzie. Standing under 4 feet tall, with a small head, hunched posture, and large, expressive eyes, Schlitzie lived with a condition known as microcephaly, possibly linked to Seckle syndrome. His cognitive and physical development were significantly affected, and he functioned with the emotional innocence of a child. But to audiences, Schlitzie was something else, a curiosity. Billed in carnivals as the last of the Aztecs or the Monkey Girl, Schlitzie defied categorization. In Freaks, he wore a dress, not because of identity, but because it made hygiene easier for his caregivers. This led many to assume he was female, and even studio press materials failed to clarify the truth. He barely had lines in the film. His role wasn't to speak, but to symbolize. He was otherworldly, pitiful, eerie, whatever the scene required, and yet there was something magnetic about Schlitzie. In home videos and behind-the-scenes footage, he beams with joy, claps to music, laughs freely. He was cared for by fellow performers, particularly sideshow legend George Surtees, who became a kind of guardian when others would have abandoned him. But still, Schlitzie's life was confined to the margins. When he wasn't on film or on stage, he was often institutionalized, labeled as too unusual for society. In a cruel twist of fate, the very thing that made him employable also made him disposable. He died in 1971, far from the spotlight, long after Freaks had been buried by shame and censorship. But in recent years, his story has resurfaced, not as a novelty, but as a poignant reflection of how Hollywood once mined disability for drama while denying dignity to the person within. These early horror icons remind us not all monsters wear masks. Sometimes the scariest thing for the industry was the truth. Chapter 2: The Studio Illusion and Hidden Pain. The golden age of Hollywood was a machine, one powered not just by talent, but by control. Studios dictated everything: who you could love, how you looked, what you said, even what your body was allowed to reveal. In this world, pain was not permitted, injury was inconvenient, and disability? That was a liability to be covered, spun, or erased. No one navigated that tightrope more poignantly than Lionel Barrymore, a titan of the Barrymore dynasty, brother to John, great-uncle to Drew. Lionel was the embodiment of old-school gravitas. His voice was as crisp as starched linen. His presence, commanding. But behind the camera, Barrymore was slowly being undone by a body at war with itself. By the mid-1930s, Lionel's health began to deteriorate rapidly. A combination of hip injuries and severe arthritis left him in chronic pain. Some reports suggest a broken hip after a fall. Others point to degenerative conditions exacerbated by age. Whatever the cause, by 1938, Lionel was permanently confined to a wheelchair. For most actors, this would have meant the end. But Lionel was no ordinary performer. MGM, aware of both his talent and the awkward optics of a disabled leading man, got to work. Writers tailored scripts to accommodate his wheelchair. Directors framed him seated behind desks, cloaked in robes, propped in chairs that gave the illusion of stature. Costumers created capes and overcoats to hide his frailty. On paper, it was accommodation. In truth, it was concealment. To audiences, Barrymore still appeared imposing, particularly in his most iconic role as Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life, snarling from his chair with venom and control. But few knew that even these performances came at a price. He was often doped with morphine to get through takes. Behind closed doors, he struggled with addiction, a cocktail of painkillers and sedatives prescribed to dull the agony. Studio press releases refused to admit the full truth. Some even suggested his wheelchair was a prop used for dramatic flair. Others floated vague rumors of rheumatism, sidestepping the real degenerative conditions he faced. Barrymore himself contributed to the myth, giving interviews that downplayed his suffering, insisting he was just more comfortable seated. But comfort had nothing to do with it. He had no choice, and he was far from alone. As Barrymore aged under studio protection, a lesser-known actor, William Shallard, navigated similar struggles, albeit decades later in the television era. Though best known for his warm, avuncular roles in the 1950s and 60s, Shallard eventually developed peripheral neuropathy, a nerve condition that impaired movement in his legs and made walking painful. In his later years, he used leg braces and often required a wheelchair, but you'd never know it from his performances. Just as in Barrymore's day, scripts were altered, blocking was adjusted, and cameras cropped above the waist. Shallard, like many, was expected to act as if nothing had changed. Disability was invisible, even when it was present. The culture of the time demanded it. For male actors, weakness could end a career. For women, even a limp or a scar could exile them permanently from stardom. So they complied. They hid pain behind polish, reshaped their bodies with corsets, surgeries, and silence. To be vulnerable in real life was to risk being discarded on screen. In these decades, there was no room for complication, no space for stars to simply be human. They were figures of fantasy, and anything that broke the illusion had to be concealed at all costs, even when it meant denying the reality of a body slowly breaking down. The studio system didn't just own your name, it owned your body, and it had no patience for imperfection. But some actors refused to let that silence define them. They found ways, subtle, brave, often painful ways, to keep performing, to keep creating, to keep existing in an industry that demanded perfection while offering none in return. In their quiet defiance, they carved a space for the stories we're finally allowed to tell today. Chapter 3: Dwarfism, Disguises, and Tall Tales. The closer one looked, the more elaborate the illusion became. Not all concealment in Hollywood came from studio pressure. Sometimes it came from the performers themselves, spinning myths as ornate as any script. And no one spun those myths with more flair or desperation than Michael Dunn. Born Gary Neal Miller in 1934, Dunn would become a beloved character actor, best remembered for his role as Dr. Lovelace in the 1960s series The Wild Wild West. Standing at just 3 feet 11 inches, he lived with a rare form of skeletal dysplasia, a group of conditions that distort bone growth and development, resulting in short stature, joint issues, and often chronic pain. But in interviews, he claimed to be a trained pilot, a judo black belt, a classically trained pianist who performed with symphony orchestras, a secret genius fluent in multiple languages. Some of it was true, much of it was not. These fabrications weren't just harmless flourishes. They were a lifeline. In an industry that saw little value in disability unless it served a gag or grotesque, Dunn knew he had to control his narrative or be consumed by it. So he created a persona larger than life. A man who was extraordinary, not despite his body, but because of it. He wore custom-tailored suits, always immaculately styled. He spoke in grand metaphors. He flirted with interviewers, played up his romantic escapades, and insisted on being called the thimble-sized playboy. All of it carefully orchestrated to deflect from the physical reality he rarely acknowledged. The truth was far more fragile. His condition, likely a variation of spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia, caused severe osteoarthritis, respiratory complications, and extreme strain on his internal organs. His torso was full-sized, but his limbs were short, giving him a waddling gait and limited mobility. Every movement required energy. Every role required careful planning. But his talent eclipsed his limitations. He delivered rich, theatrical performances, often villainous, sometimes poignant, infusing his characters with intelligence, wit, and mystery. He was never the butt of the joke. He refused to be. Still, the cost was steep. Dunn's health declined rapidly in his 30s. Years of pushing his body in roles not built for it, of pretending he was invincible, took a quiet toll. His lungs, already compromised by his condition, began to fail. His heart worked overtime. In 1973, at just 38 years old, he died from cor pulmonale, a form of heart failure caused by chronic lung disease. His ashes were scattered into the Pacific Ocean, just as he had requested. Michael Dunn lived his entire life as a performance, not just on screen, but off. He hid his pain behind charm, his fear behind jokes, his disability behind daring. He was both mythmaker and myth. But beneath it all, there was a man desperate to be seen as whole, not for what his body could or couldn't do, but for the mind and soul that outshone it all. His story is a reminder. Sometimes the most elaborate disguises are worn not to deceive, but to survive. Chapter 4. The Invisible Disabilities and Unseen Battles. By the 1940s, the Hollywood machine had mastered illusion, but it wasn't just faces and names that got rewritten. Bodies were constantly edited, sculpted, hidden behind wardrobe, makeup, and clever camera angles. And often, the disabilities that didn't appear obvious were the easiest to suppress. There was no public sympathy for quiet suffering. A star was expected to shine, not limp. Take the example of birth defects. In an industry where symmetry was godlike, even the smallest imperfection could spell disaster. Some actors reportedly underwent painful surgeries to remove supernumerary digits, extra fingers or toes, before ever stepping in front of a camera. Others used strategic hand placement or gloves in every scene. This was more common than records admit, because the studios ensured those records vanished. Peter Lorre, the Hungarian-American actor famous for roles in M and Casablanca, had a distinct look: bulging, heavy-lidded eyes, and an unsettling vocal cadence. What many audiences never knew was that his appearance stemmed, in part, from a childhood illness and complications from long-term drug use, including morphine, originally prescribed to treat gallbladder issues. The haunting eyes, so emblematic of menace, were the result of real, lifelong health struggles and side effects the studio never acknowledged. Montgomery Clift, the archetype of brooding sensitivity in the 1950s, lived a life divided in two, before and after the accident. In 1956, he suffered a near-fatal car crash that shattered his face and left one side permanently paralyzed. His recovery was grueling. His jaw had to be wired shut, his face reconstructed. Yet he returned to the screen mere months later, expected to perform as if nothing had happened. Studios relied on lighting tricks, makeup artists, and careful blocking to obscure the damage. Scenes were shot from one side only. Prosthetics and retouched close-ups became routine. His performances remained brilliant, but he was never the same. His pain was chronic. His self-worth deteriorated, and with it came addiction, depression, and eventual isolation. The industry called it the longest suicide in Hollywood, but that phrase ignores the truth. Clift was never allowed to heal. He was expected to hide his trauma behind performance. There were others, actors with hearing loss, chronic fatigue, epilepsy, or degenerative diseases, whose conditions were unspoken, omitted from studio biographies and never addressed in interviews. These afflictions weren't dramatic enough to market, nor visible enough to become character traits, so they were silenced, managed privately, often with heavy medication and emotional suppression. The studios also had a vested interest in preventing public panic. The stars represented escapism. If the audience suspected that their favorite actress had a spinal deformity, or that their action hero wore a brace beneath his costume, the illusion of invincibility would shatter. Even voice was a battleground. Actors with speech impediments or stutters were retrained with brutal diction lessons. Those with vocal strain or paralysis, resulting from polio or surgical mishaps, were coached to whisper their way through scenes, with overdubs used liberally. The voice on the screen wasn't always theirs. It was simply what the studio needed it to be. Yet perhaps the most common hidden affliction was pain, back injuries, migraines, nervous tremors, ulcers. Stars performed through it all, bound by contracts, held up by stimulants and barbiturates. The glitz masked a constant background of discomfort and denial. To admit to being unwell was to risk being replaced, and so they smiled, they danced, they sang, because to falter was to disappear. It wasn't just about hiding physical limitations, it was about maintaining the fiction that stardom meant perfection, that these people, revered by millions, were immune to the human condition, but they weren't, and the more they hid, the more alone they became. What emerged was a culture where disability was invisible, not because it didn't exist, but because no one dared acknowledge it. Yet it was there, stitched into every frame. A trembling hand held still for a close-up, a brace beneath a ballroom gown, a clenched jaw masking a scream. Hollywood, for all its glamour, never stopped being a battlefield. and for many of its stars, the war was not fought on the screen, but within their own bodies. Chapter 5. Character arcs and emotional threads. As the spotlight fades and the curtain draws back, what remains are not just the roles these actors played, but the quiet heroism of their survival. Beneath the makeup, behind the camera, beyond the scripts, lay lives twisted not by plot, but by pain, secrets, and the aching need to be seen fully. Because behind every concealed diagnosis was a character arc that went unwritten, but was deeply felt. Rondo Hatton, once a handsome athlete, watched his face become the very thing that others feared. His journey wasn't just a medical descent into acromegaly, it was a spiritual exile from the world he once knew. The man who had once walked through life unnoticed became a spectacle overnight, hunted not by paparazzi, but by his own body. What might his story have been if he had been offered dignity instead of distortion? Schlitzie, born into a world that never gave him the words to define himself, lived on the margins of every space he entered. Was he ever truly acting in Freaks, or simply being filmed through the lens of others' pity? Yet, even so, he radiated something real, a joy, a vulnerability, that pierced the voyeurism of the audience and reminded them of something too often forgotten. Humanity does not require intellect or language or symmetry. It only requires presence. Lionel Barrymore, proud, stoic, trapped in a chair he could never leave, transformed his physical decline into theatrical gravitas. His arc was not that of a fallen star, but of a man reimagined, refusing to disappear even as his body narrowed his world. He wielded power through voice, through stare, through force of will, but beneath the robes and roles, the pain was unrelenting, and the silence around it deafening. Michael Dunn, the eternal trickster, created a persona so dazzling it nearly eclipsed the suffering that fueled it. His arc was that of a magician, not in the casting of spells, but in the deflection of truth. He taught the audience to look over here, at the charm, the wit, the bravado, so they wouldn't look at the braces on his legs, the tubes for oxygen, the exhaustion in his eyes. His greatest illusion was that he was fine. And all around them, countless unnamed stars danced the same tragic choreography, a public life stitched together from half-truths and deflected realities. Behind the fantasy, their bodies sagged with effort. Behind the applause, their souls trembled with fatigue. Yet what ties all their stories together is not simply their pain, but their persistence. They endured in silence, not because they were martyrs, but because they had to, because to stop was to disappear. And the one thing more terrifying than being misunderstood was being forgotten. Their arcs weren't just stories of decline. They were stories of defiance. They pushed against the margins of an industry that only wanted them whole. They refused invisibility, even when their roles demanded they be less than themselves. In doing so, they cracked the mirror that Hollywood so carefully held up to the world. And from those cracks came something more powerful than perfection: truth. It would take decades for that truth to be fully acknowledged, for actors with disabilities to be seen not as anomalies or cautionary tales, but as whole artists with stories worth telling. But it began here, in the lives of these men and women who, with every scene they stole, every line they spoke, every frame they inhabited, said, "I am here, in this body, in this truth, and I will not be erased." Chapter 6. When secrets break through. Illusions are fragile. For decades, Hollywood's magic act seemed unbreakable. The actors remained pristine, the stories seamless, and the lies, well, they passed as truth. But time has a way of undoing even the most tightly held deceptions. Slowly, inevitably, the secrets began to slip through the cracks. Some were revealed by death, others by confession, and still others simply couldn't be hidden anymore. Rondo Hatton was one of the first to crumble beneath the weight of his myth. The Creeper wasn't just a character, he was a prophecy. The same condition that made Rondo marketable also killed him. He died of heart failure, alone in his home, just after completing one final horror film. The newspapers mourned a monster. Few paused to ask who the man had been. In his wake, questions surfaced. The studio's gas exposure story unraveled. Medical experts pointed to acromegaly. Fans were stunned. not just by the lie, but by the exploitation. For the first time, the audience confronted the reality that what they had consumed as fiction was, in fact, someone's agony, and they had applauded it. Montgomery Clift's downfall was even more visible. The man once hailed as one of the most beautiful faces on film was forced to carry the evidence of his trauma in every close-up. After his accident, the difference in his appearance was jarring. His left side drooped, his smile stiffened, his eyes darkened with pain. He continued acting, yes, but the mask cracked. The audience began to whisper. He never spoke openly about his disfigurement, but it haunted his performances. The broken man on screen was no longer a role, it was real. He turned to pills and alcohol, chasing numbness as the industry slowly turned away from him. The crash hadn't just shattered his bones, it had exposed the illusion. Hollywood, uncomfortable with visible vulnerability, left him behind. Michael Dunn's carefully maintained myth collapsed quietly, almost gently. He never stopped performing, never dropped the charm, but his body did. By the end, he could barely walk. He needed oxygen tubes to sleep. The man who had convinced the world he was larger than life died in a hospital bed, exhausted by the very performance that had kept him alive. His death was ruled as resulting from heart failure, caused by the same skeletal dysplasia he had spent years downplaying. His fans mourned, but his story, once obscured by theatrics, slowly became one of advocacy. In his legacy, a question began to form. Why did he have to hide? That question echoed through time. The industry that once shunned imperfection began to reckon with its past. Actors with disabilities, once hidden, began to demand roles, not as gimmicks, but as humans. Activists like Marlee Matlin, R.J. Mehta, and Adam Pearson stepped forward. Directors who once cast able-bodied actors in disabled roles faced backlash. Films like The Sessions and Coda gained recognition not just for their performances, but for their honesty. The spell had been broken. The truth, it turned out, was not as frightening as the studios once feared. In fact, it was liberating. Audiences, no longer content with Polish alone, began to hunger for complexity. They craved vulnerability. They wanted stories that reflected the full scope of human experience, including pain, illness, and difference. Slowly, roles expanded. Acceptance widened. Representation, while still flawed, began to take root. But for the stars of the Golden Age, that reckoning came too late. They bore their burdens in silence. Their bodies were battlegrounds hidden beneath satin gowns and three-piece suits. And the industry, grateful for their silence, left them no room for fragility. It is only now, as we piece together their stories, that we begin to understand the cost of those secrets. What was lost, what might have been. Their bodies broke, but their spirits linger, etched into film stock, threaded through old interviews, and burned into the collective memory of a Hollywood that built itself on illusion, and learned too late that truth was always the better story. Chapter 7. When the curtain falls, the truth that wouldn't stay buried. In the end, the stage always goes dark. The costumes are hung, the makeup is wiped clean, and what remains is not the character, not the legend, not the marquee name in bold gold letters, but the person, the body, the quiet, unrelenting truth of it. There is something profoundly human in this realization, that those we once worshipped as flawless were not gods at all, but people, tired people, hurt people, brave people, people who bore the unbearable, not because it made them stronger, but because the world around them demanded they appear untouched. Rondo Hatton, with hands that no longer obeyed him, still lifted scripts with trembling dignity. Lionel Barrymore, cloaked in velvet robes and grandfatherly scorn, masked the unbearable pain that locked his limbs in place. Michael Dunn, smiling through applause, buried the heavy breath and aching bones under charm and silk. Schlitzie, childlike and wide-eyed, danced at the edge of understanding, asking for nothing more than to be seen with gentleness. They were never the problem. The problem was the mirror Hollywood held up to the world, a mirror that reflected only the polished, the symmetrical, the silent. Anything outside the frame was declared unworthy. Anything irregular was warped into a monster or erased entirely. And yet, despite that cruelty, these actors remained. Their images endure, not just because they were great performers, but because they left behind something real, something irreplaceable, something that chipped away at the facade and said, "See me, all of me." They left behind more than fame or film. They left behind a legacy of endurance, a roadmap of what it means to navigate a world that asks you to disappear while refusing to do so. It is our turn now to look back, to really see them, not as cautionary tales or tragic curiosities, but as artists who carried the weight of myth on backs already broken. They never asked to be hidden, and now they are hidden no longer, because the truth, like a star once silenced, always finds its way to light. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment down below as it helps support this channel. Also, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our newest videos. Thanks for watching. Thanks.